Hey kids, let us now look at this problem of JEE Advanced 2017 Maths Paper 1. The question is, let a function be defined from real to 0, 1, be a continuous function, then which of the following functions has or have the value 0 at some point in the interval 0, 1. Now you can see that in this particular question we have 4 options, and since this is a multiple choice possible questions, we are going to see this particular question option by option. Now let's start with the first option, that is option A, and in this option A we are going to consider a whole new function which will be g of x. We'll define this g of x as this option A itself, which is f of x plus integration 0 to pi by 2 f of t sin t dt. Now here in this particular function, if I substitute the value of x as 0, then we are going to get the value of g of 0 as f of 0 plus some value of this particular function, which is integration 0 to pi by 2 f of t sin t dt. The point is, since this value is being substituted, this x has been substituted as 0, so there will be no particular function of this particular value or no particular role of this value over here, and we can say that this g of 0 in this particular case, well, it will be greater than or equal to f of 0 plus, now the minimum value of this f of t dot sin t dt will be 0 when the value of t is 0 is substituted in this after integration. Now when we will substitute this value, we will get the value as f of 0 plus 0, and then again we are going to get here f of 0 plus pi by 2, as pi by 2 can be the maximum value of this function when this sin t becomes, well, out of question, or it becomes redundant. Now since you can see that the value of g of 0 is going to lie between 0 to pi by 2, hence I can say that g of 0 is positive. Similarly, now we are going to do the same thing for g of 1, and for doing this thing for g of 1, we can say that g of 1 will be equal to f of 1 plus integration 0 to pi by 2 ft dot sin t dt. We know that this g of 1 will now lie between f of 1 plus 0 and less than equal to f of 1 plus pi by 2. Again, the 0 and pi by 2 are the minimum maximum values of this f of t into sin t dt, and this means that g of 1 is also positive. Now we know that if a function has or is crossing this 0 point in the interval 0, 1, then in that particular case g of 0 into g of 1 should be less than 0. But here you can see that since g of 0 and g of 1 is positive, then we can say that in reality, since g of 0 into g of 1 is greater than 0, hence we can say that this option is actually incorrect. That is, this particular function doesn't cross through the value 0 at any point in the interval 0, 1. Let us now look at option B. Again, we are going to redefine this option B as g of x, and this g of x will be given the value as e raised to the power x minus integration 0 to x f of t sin t dt. Again, we are going to use the same concept which we used in the previous option, that is, we are going to initially substitute the value of g of 0, the value of x as 0. In that particular case, the minimum value of this g of 0 can be equal to, or the maximum value, it can be anything, well, the value this g of 0 will attain will be e raised to the power 0 minus, when this value becomes 0, so 0, and so it will be equal to 1. Then again, if I talk about the other particular value, which is at g of 1, then this g of 1 will be equal to e minus the value f of t dot sin t dt attains its maximum value when this sin t, that is t, is equal to pi by 2. So if this value will become 1 and the value of x is replaced at 1, then I can say that this value will become f of 1 only, or I can say that this value will simply become 1. Now this g of 1 will be equal to e minus 1, and we know that this e minus 1 is again greater than equal to 0 because this function is defined from real to 0, 1. Now since this e minus 1 is also greater than or equal to 0, I can say that g of 0 and g of 1 both are positive. And since this g of 0 and g of 1 both are positive, we can say that g of 0 into g of 1 is greater than 0, which again is not possible for this function to pass through the value 0 at some point in the interval 0, 1. And so we can say that this option B is again an incorrect option. Let us now look at this option C. This option C is x minus integration 0 to pi by 2 minus x f of t dot cos t dt. Again we are going to redefine this particular function as g of x is equal to x minus integration 0 to pi by 2 minus x f of t cos t dt. Here you can see that if I consider the value of g of 0, then g of 0 will be equal to 0 minus integration 0 to f of 0 to pi by 2 minus this 0. So simply pi by 2 into f of t cos t dt. Now if we talk about the range of the values of g of 0, then I can say that the maximum value this function can attain will be pi by 2 and the minimum value that it can attain will be 0, because cos t is multiplied to it and its value will oscillate from 0 to 1. Now since its value will oscillate from 0 to 1, I can say that this particular function can attain a maximum value of pi by 2, and when it attains the value of pi by 2, this value g of 0, well, this g of 0 will be greater than or equal to minus pi by 2, because there is a negative sign over here. So 0 minus pi by 2 will give us the result as minus pi by 2, and I can say that this value will then be equal to 0 minus 0, and so this will be 0. So the range of g of 0 is from minus pi by 2 to 0, and that way I can say that this g of 0 has to be negative or equal to 0. At the same time, if I now substitute the value of x as 1, then g of 1 will be equal to 1 minus integration 0 to pi by 2 minus 1 f of t cos t dt. Here I can say that the value of g of 1 will now lie between 1 minus pi by 2 minus 1 to 1 minus 0. Here if we now talk about the value of g of 1, I can say that the value of g of 1 will be greater than or equal to 2 minus pi by 2 and less than equal to 1. That way I can say that the value of g of 1 is positive. Now since g of 0 is less than or equal to 0 and g of 1 is greater than 0 for sure, I can say that g of 0 into g of 1 will be less than or equal to 0. And since this particular function is less than or equal to 0, we can say that this particular function will have the value 0 at some point in the interval 0, 1. And so this is our one possible answer. Let us now look at this option D. This option D, well, we'll redefine it as g of x is equal to x raised to the power 9 minus f of x. Now, if I substitute the value of x as 0, then we are going to get g of 0 is equal to 0 minus f of 0. The point here is that the value of f of 0, it is going to oscillate or be around somewhere in between 0 to 1. That way I can say that if the value of f of 0 is 0, then g of 0 will reach the value 0, and if the value of f of 0 is tending towards 1, then g of 0 will be equal to 0 minus 1, that is minus 1. So this g of 0, this value will now belong to minus 1, 0, depending upon the value of f of 0 over here. Similarly, if I now find the value of g of 1, it will be equal to 1 minus f of 0. Now again, depending upon the value of f of 0, we can say that this g of 1, well, it can be either 0, that is reaching towards 0 when the value of f of 0 is 1, and similarly it can be tending towards 1 if the value of f of 0 is tending towards 0. So I can again say that the value of g of 0 is less than 0 and g of 1 is greater than 0. Therefore, g of 0 into g of 1 is less than 0, and so this particular function will have a value which touches the point 0 at some point in the interval 0, 1. And so this also is going to be another possible answer. So finally we can say that for this particular question, option C and option D are correct answer.